Before the first case of violence appears, before the first slasher starts slicing and dicing your body, before legions of creatures and mutations begin happening to all your friends, families, and coworkers, there's evidence that everything is about to go from bad to worse depending on where you look. As the marker was uncovered on Aegis 7, an energy pulse would be sent out at first, which really didn't appear to do all that much. Of course, just like with radiation, while the effects may not be immediately felt, there is damage incurred that becomes absolutely detrimental to your cellular activity. As everyone would go home for the day, little did they know, all cellular activity in the area would be affected dependent upon its level of complexity. As people would turn back up for work over the ensuing days, a type of film would appear in several different areas. Not thinking anything of it as it was a pretty dirty place that they were working, they would continue to just kind of ignore it. Obviously, this was the janitor's problem. Eventually, though, the material was all over the ceilings, walls, doors, and floors, and it would demand attention because it was blocking everything. At first, not really understanding what it was or what it was doing there in the first place, a cleanup mission would be launched in order to remove this material. As they set in on the fleshy coverings, they would cut it away from doors at first to regain entry points to rooms that had been cut off for a little while. Upon opening some of those doors, they would find the rooms were completely inundated with this flesh. As they dissolved it in some areas with fires, it would then show back up in others that they had just finished cleaning. It would seem that whatever this was really more of a nuisance. Maybe some local microorganisms like a fungus or something may have just cropped up was the general idea, but as time continued, it would become clear that it was much more than that. So in today's episode, let's discuss the viral capabilities of the microbes associated with the corruption and dive into how it spreads, what its purpose is, and why it was able to do what it did in Dead Space, and I guess also the Dead Space remake. With this mystery flesh in the pits of Aegis 7 continuing to spread, eventually it just became a known working hazard. Some would immediately point to the marker and gather that something must be going on with some form of connection between the two events. Others would just completely ignore it. But those that made the connection wouldn't likely live to see how correct they actually were. As we all know, the marker works not so much in the physical, but more on an energetic level. Again, you can liken this energetic pulse being sent out to sort of like radiation that will affect people in varying ways depending upon how intelligent they actually are. But I can already hear you saying, yes, Roanoke, everyone says, oh, intelligent affects, how the marker affects you, but why is this the case? Well, I'm glad you asked. It seems as though you probably would survive at least for a week under the influence of the marker. I kind of have a working hypothesis on how this may be possible, given the context clues that we have seen. Intelligence is very much so based on brain structure and available biomass to some degree. Now, a lot of people like to counter with this idea of saying, oh, but Einstein's brain was smaller than normal, yet he was highly intelligent. And yes, this is true, but it's not the whole story. Einstein's brain was roughly about 1,230 grams, which is actually on the low end of average for modern humans, with an average brain for adult males being around 1,336 grams. So, how is he so intelligent? From the physical structuring of his brain, we can see that there are two structures specifically that were 15% larger than average on his parietal lobes, the left angular gyrus and the supramarginal gyrus. The size of the brain is not as important as the actual folds that are located, as this kind of creates an environment where specifically more cells and connections can be housed in that area. In Einstein, because these areas were larger than normal and also he had like an extra gyri, this may have allowed for an increase in intelligence, which we can use to apply to how some people are able to work out what the marker signal is saying essentially, and some people just kind of start slamming their heads into doors and walls and anything that they can because it must be super annoying having a voice in your head that doesn't shut up. So now you can think of the marker signal in this capacity as not really caring for anything apart from the intended target that is capable of furthering its own outbreak capacity, but the marker signal will also corrupt everything. In those with the larger cerebelloparietal component and frontal component, they will be able to see symbols and letterings and numbers. Of course, it's all in Brother and Moon language, but they'll be able to work out what this signal is trying to say. This would seem to imply that the marker signal requires a certain amount of biomass within these areas of the brain in order for it to actually not induce madness. You can think of it like the marker forcibly depolarizing your neurons, and if there are enough neurons, the chain is complete and they are able to handle and work out this information. If you are just of average intelligence, or even below average intelligence, there is not enough tissue to fully grasp the framework of the marker signal, and so it just becomes noise. As your brain panics from essentially operating in a waking seizure, this would cause hallucinations, which in turn is also what the marker wants for those who are not able to further its ultimate goal of building more markers. This neurology and functionality of these areas specifically can show why engineers, such as Isaac, are able to contend with the marker signal at least for a little while. as more neurons in this area are going to be associated with higher intelligence, and if you're an engineer, well, that's a job full of nerds. I've been on a few dates with some engineers at this point. I am a reputable source. I can tell you that they're nerds, and now I'm moving on to Blue Origin employees. They should have never let me in this town. Anyhow, this is also why, take for instance in Dead Space 3, Carver pretty much almost immediately starts succumbing to the marker signal, whereas Isaac survived all of the Ishimura, and I mean, he had issues obviously, but Carver was not of increased intelligence, so yeah, he started dropping pretty quick. Anyhow, my own lack of angular gyrus aside, associated with who I talk to out here, we can see how the marker affects the brain by inducing biological changes within the cell that are completely outside the control of the individual currently experiencing the energy exposure. To a degree, the brain can compensate for this issue, but not very effectively, I guess is the best way to put it. There are a few who are able to outright resist a signal or even cancel it out, such as Lexine Weller, but most will just absolutely start going goblin mode on anything around them. But this is with our massively complex brains and competing functional source of energy, which is our own brains. With other life forms, we have to look at the environment, which gives us some clues as to why this is happening and will explain the corruption. And I know, we're getting there in a minute, just hang with me. Way back in my episode over the viral bacteria that is associated with a Necromorph outbreak, I had people in the comments that were absolutely spilling the spaghetti out of their pocket over a statement that I made. Actually, Roanoke, bacteria can't be a virus. Were you ever even a scientist? And the answer is yes for both. I mean, you're right, bacteria cannot be a virus. Those are two different forms of life. And one of those isn't even really a form of life depending on which doctor or scientist you talk to. Which is even more alarming, but then again, prions aren't exactly alive either, and they definitely induce horrific fates in those who are exposed. My god, do prions scare the absolute hell out of me. Anyhow, this bacteria that is confirmed it is a form of bacteria is not a virus, but it has viral properties. In fact, interestingly, there is a theory floating around out there about this is how reproduction was accomplished in animals. Have you ever thought to yourself, why does a sperm nosedive into an egg and invade the egg itself when we really don't see other eukaryotes doing this? Engulfing is something that macrophages do regularly, but actually invading the cytoplasm of another cell is not something that we often see, at least our cells, doing. However, this is why it's fascinating. If correct, essentially because 8% of our genomes are viruses, it may be at some point a single-celled organism was infected with a virus and began behaving as such. Basically, it was posing. Invading other cells, while likely not very effective, the drive to do it was there by genetic programming because it had been corrupted. As multicellular organisms came into being, depending on what you believe, because, again, we still aren't sure how life got started on this rock, eventually it resulted in a form of reproduction where one cell would invade another. Essentially, this is a eukaryotic cell that has viral properties. The same can be said with some form of bacteria right now. Bacteria, known as intracellular bacterium, enter a host cell by receptor-mediated endocytosis. Basically, the host cell brings in the bacteria, but they are confined to vacuoles, but they will remain inside of the cytosol. And that is evidence of bacteria with viral properties, because it's basically tricking the cell into bringing it in, so that's exactly what a virus does. To this end, we can begin to understand what is happening with the marker. While I do believe Aegis 7 was absolutely devoid of native life, probably because, I would have to assume the Brethren Moons had already been there. There is no shot that humanity didn't accidentally seed the area with bacteria that is native to us. It is virtually impossible for us not to, considering the average male, we have roughly about 36 trillion human cells, while the average female has around 28 trillion human cells. And what's interesting is, there's about 38 trillion bacteria cells in us and on us on average, meaning really, we actually are more bacteria than human. When the signal goes out, I believe the origin of this corruption begins here. We know already that bacteria that appears to have viral properties is pretty much everywhere. Obviously, if there is no biomass available, because again, Aegis 7 was sterilized, then there is nothing to convert. Because remember, spontaneous generation does not exist. However, if you already have a species in that area operating, then it's highly likely that they would have already their own bacteria that can be altered and turned. With this operational baseline, we begin seeing the beginning of this corruption. With bacteria in general, there are a few things that should be noted, and what luck! I used to work with it. First, bacteria is incredibly fast growing depending on the species. On its own, for instance, E. coli, as long as there's resources, can divide every 20 minutes, wildly growing out of control and sapping an area of those resources, along with producing toxins. A film of sorts will actually typically show up in these cases, and this can prevent antibiotics from working with some forms of bacteria. And being that they are prokaryotes, again, they have an open cell body plan, meaning that there is no nucleus containing the genes, and instead they have free-floating circular structures called plasmids. And these can be exchanged between bacteria very easily, like with conjugation, or if any bacteria undergoes apoptosis, well, not apoptosis because then it's told to blow up, but if any bacteria is lysed and destroyed, these plasmids will leak out into the surrounding environment and other bacteria will pick it up. So finally, we have the background set up now for how the corruption gets started. Trust me, it's important because this is a science channel disguised as a gaming and movie channel. It's really just 3 scientists in a trench coat, basically. My whole goal was to get you to learn something. Get wrecked, nerd. Anyhow, fourth wall break aside, as this material spreads, you need to also understand what is actually going on and how is it accomplishing this task. So first ask yourself, how much do you really shed? And I'm not just talking about your dandruff. Walk through your house on a sunny day and see if you can spot the free-floating material all around you. That is very likely your dead skin, just hanging out, floating through the air, and you're breathing it in all the time. Our skin will shed roughly about 600,000 skin cells per day. These cells are very clearly already done with their life, but with that, there was more than just a single individual walking around Aegis 7. If I remember correctly, to make things work here, there were hundreds of colonists on the ground, so let's say around 300 people, each shedding roughly 600,000 cells per day. And I'm working off old memory, but I think they were there for around 3 years before they finally discovered the marker. So quick maths says 300 multiplied by 600,000 multiplied by 1,095 days gives us roughly 197 billion, 100 million skin cells just floating around the area. The corruption operates by using the viral bacteria to invade specifically dead cells, as it's made mention in the lore. So skin cells located on any structure that were still able to be used would be invaded by the viral bacteria shortly after the pulse was sent out. The bacteria would have its own behavior severely altered that was also in the area. Something that should be noted is that it may also be affecting specific plasmids, as it appears with eukaryotic cells, perhaps like structure's complexity concerning which genes are where, may not allow for such an easy transition, specifically within eukaryotic cells, of breaking someone down by pure exposure, but with the simplicity of prokaryotes, it may be just that effective. Or it may be that, with eukaryotic cells, it just takes longer. Although, there seems to be a connection between the living being able to resist at least the more lower level effects of the marker, versus tissue that is no longer alive being completely changed. And this may come down to something as simple as gene stability. Specifically, this may be running into issues with the already present DNA repair pathways, such as base excision repair, nucleotide excision repair, mismatch repair, homologous recombination, and non-homologous end-joining. The thing to remember is that when the marker came to Earth, there were already animals there, and for life to actually even have the ability to evolve and grow and everything. It's not that the marker started life. So things that were already going to keep genes stable were already a part of the cell, and the marker wasn't able to just completely override that. Otherwise, if it stopped it from happening, basically everybody would turn into a Cronenberg. But essentially, while the cell is alive, the repair functions remain operational, so the marker signal is not able to actually alter genes effectively, or at least it takes a much longer time to do so. And this is because your DNA is constantly being repaired as the marker causes damage. Whereas with a cell that is already expired, genes can be broken and recombined as there is no proofreading or repair pathways that are still operational. And because of this, the signal can be assumed to have a specific energetic wavelength that somehow brings specific genes into a needed sequence that allows for the cell to basically go feral, but still be a part of a multicellular organism, which we basically call that cancer. However, it first comes down to the corruption. Basically, the corruption is a corrupted cell that's just cancerous. With the viral bacteria invading cells, the genes that are still there are changed and altered, and not only does the bacteria start rapidly dividing, which is also an issue, it may be possible that the cells themselves that were invaded are reactivated. With their purpose changed and the energy they need constantly being administered by the marker signal, the cell is no longer reliant on an oxygen-based metabolism, and so is now considered, for all intents and purposes, anaerobic. This combination of altered bacteria and human cell is seen when the marker is ultimately destroyed, and then in the events of Dead Space 2, they test this fleshy material that was like a sludge, and they said 70% of it contained human DNA, indicating that the other 30% came from elsewhere, such as animals on the Ishimura or plants that were also on the ship, or other bacteria. But mostly, it was just made from homegrown humans. As the corruption continues to spread, it will inevitably begin reaching its ultimate form, which is more of like a support role. This role is intrinsic to the success of the actual outbreak, but it is very limited on its effects on the living, strangely enough. First, the corruption, as previously mentioned, presents a physical barrier to anyone trying to move through an area. Appearing as large tendrils or coverings and smelling like vomit, it can basically block doors and keep you away because it smells bad, break down bridges, or create an exceedingly slick surface on the ground. And let's say you're like running from a necromorph and then you run into a room and slip on this, no shot that you're getting back up immediately, and you're getting impaled. This physical presence that it has serves to also create traps for those that happen by. Appearing in several different ways, one of these standard traps is going to be the cyst. The cyst fires out an explosive sac. It would appear that these cysts are actually the remnants of a human brain, which let's discuss the living versus the non-living for a moment. When a living person is exposed to corruption through physical touch, nothing happens. While very likely you have to deal with the viral bacteria on them, the body seems more than equipped to deal with the infection at the beginning, as macrophages of the innate immune system immediately respond to the viral bacteria if it gains access past the skin and destroys it as it intends to do. However, the other part of the attack is still energetic. It is known in those who begin suffering from the effects of the marker signal that their sleeping patterns dropped to basically zero. They just had pure insomnia. This would severely alter their body's ability to fight infection, as the immune system would become more and more uncoordinated. But along with that, the marker signal would begin altering the functionality of the immune system itself. It is unknown how at this point, but I would hazard a guess as to say hormonal shifts in the body due to exposure would make mobilization of the innate immune system less effective. So while the corruption at first cannot get a foothold in a living person, as they are exposed to the signal for a long period of time, an infection in their body could bring them down even if their insanity or a necromorph doesn't, which is pretty good because, remember, the Brethren Moons know that they are dealing with difficult species. Some species are likely more difficult than others, and with humans being the way humans are, not only did we have the means to fight back, but people would barricade themselves. So if you can't physically get to them, and let's say, because we also knew how to stop the marker signal from exiting an area, according to Dead Space 2, or excuse me, Dead Space 3, when Danik was a total huge nerd and blew up the one on the moon, then that means the other way they're going to get to you is by the air. So in a non-living person, we can see the effects of falling into the corruption. The corruption operates like glue in some capacity and scissors in others. In some, their body will be broken down to fuel the corruption. We see the cysts, like the brain is liberated from the skull and infused with the viral bacteria that has concussive force detonating tendencies, much like the exploders. These brains are used to attack others as more are then brought down the pipeline to continue fueling the cyst. Others are just completely dissolved to nothing but a skeleton. We find examples of this with exposed vertebral columns, skulls, long bones, basically just everybody's skeletons for the most part. Though, it seems that the corruption itself has a tendency to grow bones as well as just like hold on to them. And this would be important as bones would help bolster the physical barrier presented by the corruption. Otherwise, you could just easily cut your way through. Some, however, have the fate that's even worse than those around them. If you fall into the corruption and you are near an area of importance, you may become a wall guardian, which, if you would like to see my episode over the wall guardians, I have one up, and that also, like I discussed, why I still think they're somewhat conscious. But regardless of what it does, the biomass that it takes in will be available to add to other frames to create many different forms of necromorphs, but its ultimate goal is assimilation of all available life forms in the area. It doesn't matter what species it is, plant, animal, arcade, doesn't care. So to achieve this, it will have to go beyond just waiting for someone to fall near it. As the biomass continues to grow, you have to remember that it is not limited to just available resources around it. The corruption is set on a cellular level to divide every minute, which puts it 20 times faster than E. coli. This would not be sustainable given any other circumstances apart from the mystery energy coming off the marker. The corruption's entire metabolism is now based on energy usage of the marker, and with that, it is able to continue and grow at a pace that, if you really looked at it, would completely take over a planet in a short amount of time, absolutely dwarfing the number of naturally occurring cells on the planet. The whole point is to start changing the atmosphere. Seeing how the metabolism has changed, the standard function would actually potentially do the same thing, but takes longer. Turning oxygen into CO2, this would actually deprive animals of oxygen, but in turn, plants in the area would be absolutely thriving. So the corruption has another plan. Turn the air toxic to everything. As oxygen is pulled away from the atmosphere, what is exuded is completely biologically toxic. It appears based on people coughing that when this stuff comes into contact with their lungs, this lung irritant may be inducing some form of anaphylaxis in people, basically an allergic reaction, inflaming lung tissue, making it difficult to breathe. If you exit the environment, then your body can actually remove this toxin because you have little cilia in your lungs that kind of push things out. But if you remain in the affected area, it may be that your lungs completely inflame, not allowing you to breathe in more oxygen, or at least there's no oxygen in the area, causing you to choke to death, thus dropping you to become more biomass. If this was on a planet, the atmosphere would become quickly corrupted as oxygen levels tanked. And that's just for our planet. Other aliens that came into contact with the corruption, specifically the Tau Volantians, likely had to deal with the same issue, but they just lived in water, may have just had the water polluted, or even other air is just taken out of their environment, or it's deoxygenated, because remember, animals need oxygen and water, at least on our planet, and then it's just replaced by toxins, no matter what it is. When a planet is conquered, though, let's be real, the whole planet is going to look like a super gore nest from Doom Eternal. And this is the end goal of the corruption. With the battles already fought, the Necromorphs reformed over and over again as the corruption got to them, new biomass being added from resistance forces, and really a critical level being hit surrounding the marker, a convergence event would begin. And the whole point of this is that let's say you dug yourself deep into the ground, it really doesn't matter. This would cause all corruption on the surface to surround the marker and then shoot skyward to become a Brethren moon. And remember, Brethren moons rip away the atmosphere, they rip away basically the surface of the planet. It all becomes just the Brethren moon. So even if you were hiding in the surface of the planet, congratulations, you're now in space. But it's important to note that for the Brethren moon, they were really there all along. Who knows, maybe the Brethren moons were just the biomass tentacles we met along the way. Occasionally, depending on how annoying you are also, seemingly sentient tentacles will find you and attempt to drag you to your doom. And these are never really shown what exactly these are, but if you're not packing heat, remember stay strapped or get clapped, they will just easily crush you in the hidey hole and then smear you to become biomass. But the corruption is just the earliest form of the Brethren moon. We see varying levels of intelligence the corruption displays, such as with the Leviathan on the Ishimura. Able to attack Isaac, it is responding to its environment, not just existing. The tentacles that also attack are also responding to human movement. It's just on a smaller scale that these things exist. Then with the hive mind itself, that's really just a larger tentacle. And that had all the tributary tentacles kind of feed into it. All of this tissue comes together, but when alone, it just appears like a random mass of cells. Sort of like, an ant crawling on your leg. You may not be fully aware that it's there, and it may not be fully aware that you're a living organism, but when it bites you, you become aware of it. And it becomes aware you're alive, and then it's instantly crushed. That's basically the Brethren moons interacting with humanity. So the corruption is nothing more than a Brethren moon that has not hit its final form. Used to change the atmosphere and build necromorphs, to be honest with you, that should be the main focus of the actual attack. While the marker should be number one, the corruption is building necromorphs and changing the air. By stopping that, you wouldn't have to worry about the corruption getting up necros that you just dismembered. Of course, by dismembering them, you've actually created a new area for the corruption to start spreading. In Dead Space 3, the SCAF had it right when they made the gas that eats your face. It would rapidly eat through the corruption, destroying it where you can actually hear it scream in minutes, not allowing it to grow back quickly. Ultimately, though, if you don't get the corruption under control, while it may seem like more of a nuisance, it's actually a sleeping giant waiting to be awoken. But anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, then leaving a like would be awesome of you, and subscribing is a great way to stay up to date on when I post. I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, Roanoke Tales, and merch links in the description, where we talked, I think, last week on Roanoke Tales about the giant they found in Afghanistan that apparently ate soldiers. You should go check it out. I thought it was pretty good. Anyhow, speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. First, huge thank you to our astrophysicist, Des Dancer. Thank you, my man. I'd also like to thank our scientist, Chad the Enjoyer of Scientific Explanations of B-grade horror movies, Dakota23, Josh Blanchard, Lucian Dragon, Metric System, The Last Final Girl on the Left, and Trash Panda in a Trench Coat. And to the rest of my patrons, I appreciate your support as well. Your help goes a long way towards keeping this channel running and is greatly appreciated. All right, so that's going to do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I'll see y'all in the next one.